small Dorset town of Wareham has a long and checkered past which spans the past 2,000 years. Situated between two rivers, the Piddle to the north and the Froom to the south, its boundaries are marked by ancient fortifications, constructed when the kings of Wessex defended England against marauding Vikings. The town's remarkable history and development can be read in its varied architecture, as well as in the archaeological, documentary and photographic records. Our guides to the history of Wareham are local historian and author Lilian Ladle and resident journalist Andrew Wright. Our visit to the town begins along the banks of the River Froom, at the quay, which has long been the focal point of the town. The many visitors who pass through Wareham on their way to Studland, Swanage and the Purbeck Hills are drawn to the quay for its peaceful charm. The quay is undoubtedly Wareham's most visited, photographed and painted location. But there is more to discover, as Lilian and Andrew will now reveal.
It's very peaceful now at Wareham Quay, but it didn't always used to be that way, did it?
I guess not. It's been the focus of the town's trade for at least 2,000 years. For example, the Romans traded pottery from here. Later, the Viking longships sailed up the Froom with the intent of sacking the town. And after the Norman conquest, there was a huge amount of trade in things like wine, salt, corn and leather, because transport by water was quicker and often safer than transporting by road. And later, fairly recently, pipe clay was an important export from Wareham.
So when did Wareham Quay stop being a hive of activity?
Well, Poole got its charter in 1248 and it grew very, very rapidly. And really from the early Middle Ages, Wareham declined. I think the heyday was in the Norman period. Today we look at the tourists and the boats and the yachts moored at the quay, and it's a shadow of what it must have been like years ago.
Of course, next to Wareham Quay we've got South Bridge, which is the main route into Wareham from the south, but the bridge didn't always look like that, did it?
No, it didn't. We know that there was a stone-built Norman bridge over the river, and then in the late 18th century that was replaced by another stone bridge. It had 5 arches, it was a very steep incline, humpbacked, but it was only single track, and in 1927 that was knocked down and replaced by the present concrete bridge we see in front of us today.
Now why don't we start our tour of the town perhaps from St John's Hill?
I think that would be a very, very good starting point.
Coming on to St John's Hill, how did it get the name?
Well, in the 1300s, on our left was a chapel dedicated to St John the Baptist. But of course the history of this area goes way back beyond that.
How far?
To at least the Roman period. In front of us was quite an extensive Roman cemetery. To the east were the boundaries of a Celtic monastery. We have Saxon Mint House, and it was a medieval market area, and of course today a modern car park.
Now over here we have the Mint House, but nothing to do with polos.
I'm afraid not. No, its history goes back to the Saxon period, when it was reputed to be the site of the place where coinage was made, and the minter was the man who was responsible for this. The blacksmith forged the coin, the minter made it. I'm afraid the end of the Mint House was very gruesome, because by the time we come to the 1100s, the coinage, which was a single silver penny, had been very debased, and the minters were responsible for this. And King Henry II recalled all the country's minters to Winchester, and the punishment was that they had their right hands cut off, and the right hands were returned to the towns and nailed to the smithy door, and I'm afraid they were castrated as well.
Rather severe punishment.
Very severe punishment, and we don't know how many survived, but Wareham's Mint didn't operate after that date.
Now, of course, St John's Hill goes back to the Roman times as well, doesn't it?
It does, and if we walk across the road to where this rather nice tree is now, about 1,600, 700 years ago, this was a burial site, and the whole area had lots and lots of burials in, and they differ from burials today. Christian burials, of course, are always aligned east-west. These burials were north-south, and very, very odd. Lots of them didn't have any heads. The heads had been taken away, buried separately, and some of them were buried facing down.
And are there still skeletons down there today?
When this tree was planted, the workman who was digging the trench for the tree actually dug up a skull as he was digging the trench. So yes, there are still burials. It's known that 200-300 years ago, when it rained hard, bones would wash out of the earth. Before we leave St John's Hill to look at the church, I'd like to show you the Bon, which is about 150 metres from where we're standing.
Now that is a lovely building, but how come such a posh doorway on just a bar?
Well, shall we go up and have a look at it, and I'll tell you why. It's lovely Purbeck stone, isn't it? Really nice.
But it's a bit boss-eyed.
It is a bit boss-eyed, and either it was a drunk mason or the stonework must have come from another building and it's been reused and set into the Bon as it was being built. The Bon dates from about 1500. It's one of the oldest buildings in the town.
It is beautiful.
It's rather nice, and as you can see, it's been extended with brickwork on top of the stonework. And when it was first built, it extended all the way down the little lane there.
So the door was second-hand and just basically
It was
sort of
indeed, yes.
added because you like the look of it.
Recycling is not new.
That's a lovely building.
It is, and if you like this building, you're going to absolutely adore the church. Shall we go and have a look?
It's only just down here, isn't it?
It is. Now, Andrew, I want to show you the parish church of Lady St Mary. It's been a place of worship for the last 1500 years, and the development of the town has followed the development and the evolution of the church.
It's a beautiful building, isn't
It's a superb building, even though it has been greatly altered over the centuries.
Now the view from the tower across Wareham must be absolutely fantastic.
It's panoramic. We can see all the historic sites of the town. We can see the quay, we can see St John's Hill, up North Street, St Martin's Church, and of course the surrounding countryside.
And of course it's still a place of worship today that's used by the townspeople.
Indeed it is. But shall we go in and have a look at some of the fascinating things which survive inside the church?
Lovely, isn't it? Peaceful. Absolutely idyllic. So this is Lady St Mary's Church.
It is, and people have been worshipping here for the last 1500 years. And the building we're entering reflects the changes that have happened to it over that long period of time.
Isn't it beautiful?
It's glorious.
And of course there would be no Wareham without Lady St Mary's Church.
The town developed with the church. I think before we look at some of these lovely things, we'll just have a look at the font.
Lovely. Now this is lead, isn't it?
The top is lead, it's hexagonal, and it depicts the 12 apostles, and it's on a Purbeck marble octagonal base. And it's rare because there are very, very few lead fonts in the country. I believe there are only something like 30 which survive.
So why do they use lead?
It's a status symbol. It's a status symbol.
Some lovely carving.
There's an interesting story which survives about this font, in that during the Civil War in the 17th century, when the Puritans were here, they didn't like the apostles, and the story goes that the font itself was encased in a wooden frame, and this is one of the reasons why it's reputed to have survived, because otherwise all things idolatrous, of course, were destroyed.
They've got some lovely stained glass windows here.
They're beautiful. Of course, they're all Victorian, but the spectacular window, of course, is the east window in the chancel.
That is lovely.
Shall we have a look at some of these survivors?
Now there's more to Lady St Mary's Church than just the font or the window.
There is indeed. And I'd like to show you the memorial stones of the Celtic Christians who were the first worshippers on this site. We're going to look at St Edward's Chapel, which today is the oldest part of the building. And we'll look in the chancel to see the constables of Wareham Castle, because their effigies, their stone effigies, survive.
A large church for a place like Wareham.
It is. It's surprisingly large, and it's a reflection of its early importance. It was built in stone, the original building, 700 AD, and it survived until the early 1800s. And you might wonder why it was pulled down. It was because at that stage, and we're talking about 1840, the fabric of the building had decayed. There was reputed to be green slime and mould running down the walls, and the acoustics were dreadful. The seating was inadequate, and so the people at the time deemed that the building should be rebuilt rather than restored. But of course, a very early Saxon church was pulled down, and a Victorian replacement came in its way.
So why was the church originally founded on this site? Why was this a good site for a church all those hundreds of years ago?
Because it had already been a site of Christian worship. There were Celtic people worshipping here shortly after the Romans left this country. And in fact, we can see some gravestones of those very people if we walk over here.
And indeed later on we've got a wedding here which shows the church is still a focus of worship.
It is not only a focus of worship, but it's a focus of life in the town today, as it has been for all those thousands of years.
So what about over here behind the pulpit?
Well, let's go and have a look, shall we?
A lovely wooden pulpit.
Victorian, as is the font cover. But this is what I'm really interested in. And what we've got here are the gravestones of the Celtic Christians who were worshipping here 1500 years ago. And these would originally have been in a graveyard outside a very simple, probably wooden building.
And where would that have been?
We don't know exactly, but probably on this very side. And we can see here there are four stones in this part of the church, and the fifth stone is in the vestry. They commemorate 4 men and 1 woman, and this little stone here commemorates a lady called Gongori.
And that means?
That was her name. I don't know what it means, but she was living probably between about 500 and 600 AD, when Wareham would have been a very, very small settlement. But there are other things here, as you can see, which have been, some of them dug out of the churchyard and some of them found in the church. But this in particular is
amazing.
Spectacular stone coffin.
Looks like something out of ancient Egypt.
It does, but of course it isn't. It's made out of Purbeck marble, and the story is that one of the 2 kings who was buried in this church was actually buried in this coffin. We had 2 royal burials, and unfortunately we lost both of them. The first king to be buried here was a man called Bertrick, who was king of the West Saxons, and he was buried here about 802 AD. But the burial that everyone knows about is Edward the Martyr, who died in 978, and he rested here for 3 years, and then his body was taken away to Shaftesbury Abbey. So we lost both of our kings, and all we have to show for it is this Purbeck stone coffin, which either or of them were reputed to have been buried in.
Now, of course, Edward the Martyr, he met his end at Corfe Castle, just 5 miles down the road.
He did, yes. And when his body was found, it was brought to this church, and it lay here for 3 years. And the nuns at Shaftesbury owned the church at the time, and they thought that his body was going to be taken away by the Vikings, who were invading Dorset at the time. So they took the bones away to Shaftesbury Abbey. And indeed, Shaftesbury Abbey, at the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, was one of the richest nunneries in the country. And no doubt part of that was because the bones of Edward were there, and people, of course, used to go and venerate the bones and leave offerings.
Now, what about some of these other bits of stoneware?
Well, we've got a very small coffin here, part of an old font and part of some old crosses.
All these made from local stone quarried in the Purbecks?
Exactly. So we've got the coffin of Edward the Martyr, but if we move over to the other side of the church, we've got the chapel which commemorates Edward, and indeed that's the oldest part of the church as it stands today. Shall we go and have a look inside?
Now, of course, this part of the church is much lower than the rest.
It is, and it's probably an indicator of its antiquity. It's fascinating because it shows some of the earliest uses of Purbeck marble in a church building. If we look at the columns, you'll see that they're beautifully polished, and it's got a vaulted roof, which again is early, and it dates to about 1100.
And here we've got the memorial to Hutchins, the famous Dorset historian.
We have. John Hutchins was rector here for many years, and he wrote the history of the county of Dorset while he was in office here. And as you see, it says that he died when he was 75 in 1773.
And where's he buried?
He's buried here.
Outside?
Inside.
Inside? Under where we stood?
I don't know. Now, we're sitting at the eastern end of the church, and 100 years ago, when the grave digger was digging these graves, he dug up lots of pieces of pottery, including the pieces that we're holding today. For example, this lovely red pottery is called Samian ware, and this was made in France just before and just after the Roman conquest. High-class tableware.
Highly decorated.
Beautifully decorated. And if you wanted to impress, this is what you put on the table. However, everyday ware is this sort of material.
Not quite as fine.
No, not quite as fine, much cruder. And this is called black burnished ware, and this in fact was made locally.
In Wareham?
In Wareham. There was a very highly developed pottery industry, and this sort of pottery was exported all over the country. So
And the point of export presumably was the quay and the river?
it was indeed. So we'd have ships coming up and the pottery being taken away. In particular, the army were using this sort of pottery, and it looks as though the pottery was under some sort of military control.
Now this stuff, this everyday stuff, was actually made near the bypass at Wareham, wasn't it?
It was. So where the cars and buses thunder down today, 2,000 years ago, potters were very, very busy manufacturing this sort of material.
So this was the everyday wear. That was the posh stuff to impress the relatives
Right.
and your neighbours. What about this?
This is fascinating. This is part of an amphora. So you can imagine a huge vessel. This was made in Spain, and it carried oil or wine. So the implications are that people 2,000 years ago were actually using oil and drinking wine. So it implies trade.
How about these other bits? This is the top of
That's a
another
black,
wine pot, or?
well, it is. It's pretending to be a wine pot. It's black burnished ware, so the native potters are copying continental forms. This little pot is very sweet, and it's a one-off really. It's not paralleled anywhere else in the country.
So that's unique.
This is unique.
Lovely. And that would have stored something so precious, something of which there wasn't a lot in quantity terms?
Possibly grain, possibly flour, but used as a little storage pot.
Something to be seen.
Possibly, yes. Yes.
And finally, tell me about this, because this really is very ornate here.
It is, and if you look, it's glazed. It's got a nice green glaze. This again found in the churchyard, but similar vessels to this have been found on the castle side.
And of course, it isn't just pottery that can help us uncover the past of Ware, and what other things can actually give us clues?
Well, things like documents. So the Anglo Saxon Chronicle tells us about the history of Wareham, as does the Domesday Book. And the Domesday Book tells us exactly what was happening in 1066 when William the Conqueror came and invaded and took the country.
So despite these other various sources, pottery from places such as the old Victorian graveyard here is still important in helping to fill in those historical bits and pieces.
It is. Documentary sources and pottery are really the main indicators of date.
Incredible to think that this was held how many thousand years ago?
About 1,000 years ago, give or take 100 years.
Lovely.
The earliest evidence of human activity dates back over 4,000 years, when the first hunter-gatherers came to the densely wooded areas of South Dorset. They came to fish in the rich waters of the Froom and Piddle, and to hunt wild boar and deer amongst the oak and hazel forests. Their exquisitely fashioned flint arrowheads have been found, and chart the progress from the nomadic lifestyle of hunters to farmers who settled by the edge of Poole Harbour. Lilian and her team have unearthed many important archaeological finds. This earthenware pot, painstakingly excavated from a site on the outskirts of Wareham, contained corn, which had probably been grown by one of those early farmers. A coarse heathstone quern or grinding stone would have been used to grind the corn into flour, which tells us that bread was supplementing the diet of fish and meat. This Bronze Age wood gouge would have been used by a craftsman to fashion table or chair legs on an early form of lathe. Recently, an earthenware jar containing fragments of burnt bone has been discovered. When analysed by a specialist, the remains have been identified as those of a Roman cremation. Further examination of the bone fragments have revealed that they belonged to a woman who was middle-aged at the date of death. She would have been between 4'10" and 5 foot in height, of slight build. During the English Civil War of 1642, over 4,000 soldiers were encamped in and around the town. Many personal effects, such as belt buckles, clay pipes, ammunition and coins, represent one of the many periods of turmoil in Wareham's history. The town plan has remained broadly unchanged since early Saxon times. The main roads lying north-south and east-west have resulted in a grid-like pattern of streets and lanes that are bounded by the massive earthen banks. At the crossroads of the main streets, a thriving marketplace developed, and the centre of the town was once the site of timber stalls known as the shambles. On the northwest side of the square is the Red Lion, a coaching inn where travellers rested and business was conducted on market day. Other hostelries that would have benefited from their proximity to the market square are the Duke of Wellington and the Black Bear Hotel. Local legend has it that should the bear fall into the street, the world will end, so it's securely chained to avoid catastrophe. The town hall stands opposite the Red Lion on the site of the parish hall of St Peter. Wareham's museum is tucked away between the town hall and the Duke of Wellington and is well worth a visit. Across East Street you will find the almshouses, which were originally endowed in 1418 by John Stretch. Built to accommodate 6 ancient men and 5 women, it was rebuilt in 1741. If you look below this commemorative stone, you can see the only cast insurance plaque to be found in the town. This small symbol is a clue to one of the most significant events in Wareham's history. Just around the corner in South Street stands the Lloyds Bank. 2.5 centuries ago, this site was occupied by the Bull's Head Inn. At around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, hot ashes were thrown onto a rubbish heap at the rear of the inn. The tinder-dry rubbish was soon ablaze, and the sparks set light to the thatched roof of the inn. The flames spread so quickly, with the shambles aiding the fire as it crossed from one side of the street to the other, that the townspeople were unable to save their timber-built, thatched houses, nor their possessions. In the following 4 hours, 2/3 of the town was destroyed. 133 buildings in all. A subsequent Act of Parliament forbade the use of thatch for roofing within the town. The almshouses, built of stone with slate roof and fire protection from the town's 2 fire engines, survived the fire, as did the manor house in South Street. surrounded by the inferno, but saved by its Portland stone facade and sheet lead roof.
Now we're looking at the Church of St Martin's in front of us.
It is exquisite, isn't it?
It's beautiful, and it dates back to about the time of the Norman conquest. There are some features which are late Saxon, and there are some features which are Norman, so it's a bit difficult to date it precisely.
Now it has a good command of the north side of the old town with a good sweeping views down to the river. Was that a reason for that?
It does, yes. I think there are a number of churches which are sited on entrances in and out of towns, and it was so that people would come in as they were going on journeys in or out of towns. But the architecture is superb, and it's untouched. It's got many original fixtures and fittings. I think if we walk around the corner, we can have a look at some of the original.
How come it's
small
survived
windows.
in such good condition and hasn't been changed or altered too much, especially by the Victorians?
It survived because it went out of use in the 18th century, and it was boarded up. The windows were blocked up, some were bricked up, some were boarded up, and it wasn't restored and rededicated until the 1930s.
And of course Lawrence of Arabia took a keen interest in its restoration.
He did indeed. And indeed inside the church is a very fine effigy of Lawrence, and we'll go inside and have a look. Now, what do you think?
Wow,
Isn't this spectacular?
it's like going back 1,000 years.
Well, there have been very few alterations since the church was built. Now, if we look at these arches were put in to allow a north aisle to be built to extend the church. In the late Norman period, the congregation here would only be about 50 people. And no one would be sitting down, they would all be standing to listen to the service.
And the weakest going to the wall
The
means...
weakest, elderly people and people who were frail, were allowed to lean against the wall, and that's where the expression "the weakest to the wall" has come from.
Now in front of us we have the famous effigy of Lawrence of Arabia,
We have.
carved out of Portland stone.
It is. And of course he died at Bovington, and he's buried at Morton Church. But the effigy was carved by a man called Eric Kennington, and it's been placed in the Church of St Martin's here.
Now he shopped in Wareham, he ate in Wareham when he was living at Clouds Hill, and he took an active interest in the actual restoration
He
of this
was,
church.
as well as a soldier and an airman, he was an academic, he was an archaeologist, and interested in the antiquity of this building. So it's really quite fitting that the effigy is in this church.
And now here, above this lovely arch,
Now this is one of the Norman features. We've looked at the little Saxon window, and this is one of the Norman features. So this church is enigmatic. We've got some old-fashioned Saxon architecture, and we've also got some Norman architecture, so it's very difficult to decide exactly how old the building is. But as you can see, it's really highly decorated. And if we go into the chancel, on the north chancel wall are some survivals of original paintings. As you can see, they're in what are called two registers, one level above the other, and they depict St Martin, patron saint of the church.
and they look a bit like the Bayeux tapestry, don't they,
They
in
look
style?
very, very much like the Bayeux tapestry, and of course that's the date, more or less, of the paintings. Early 12th century.
So the whole point of these wall murals is that very few people could read, so this is a way of communicating stories.
It was communicating Bible stories, and very successful it was too. Just to the right of those paintings you can see the original Saxon window, and can you see how it's splayed inwards to let the maximum amount of light in?
And yet that's a window like a castle, isn't it, in terms of defence?
Well, it's the architectural style of the period, and originally there would have been 4 tiny windows like that in the church. It would have been very dark and very, very mysterious.
Oh, it's time for a cuppa.
I think you're right.
As Lilian and Andrew head off to the Anglebury tea rooms for a coffee, we'll take a quick detour to the left of St Martin's to Shatters Hill, which is less than 50 metres away. On the outskirts of Wareham, the hill follows the inside of the town's defensive walls, leading to North Mill on the banks of the River Piddle. First recorded in 1150, the mill was sold by Henry VIII in 1544 and continued in use as a mill until the mid-1800s. From here we can see North Bridge, by which North Street leaves the town. The pointed left-hand arch is medieval, and the two rounded arches date from 1670 when the bridge was rebuilt. An inscription let into the west side of the bridge at pavement level warns potential vandals of the penalties that they risked.
Right, we've looked at the church and we're going to look at the Anglebury Coffee House. And like the church, this survived the fire as well. And it's the oldest inhabited house in the town.
Now the Anglebury, that rings a bell. There's quite a few instances of that around Wareham.
It is, and that is because it was Thomas Hardy's name for the town, and he used that name in a number of his novels.
Time for that cup of coffee.
I think that's a very good idea.
Isn't that lovely? Gorgeous.
This is fantastic, and you should taste the coffee. It's
Is it good?
fantastic. Let's go sit
Right,
down.
you treat me to a cuppa then.
I'll do that. Now, Andrew, this is probably the oldest house in Wareham, and it was built for a man who had an awful lot of money. And there are a number of things which still survive from the late 1500s when it was built. For example, the fireplace. It's nice, but this is not the original fireplace which was here. This was an upstairs bedroom, and the original fireplace is next door, and I'll show you that in a moment. And the reason it's next door is that about 100 years after the house was built, it was divided into two properties, and the fireplace which had stood here was removed. And this little funny round protuberance that we can see was the original staircase. And again, that was altered when the house was divided into two. Would you like to come and see the real fireplace? It's absolutely superb.
Brilliant.
Let's do that. Sorry. Right, now this was the original entrance to the house, but if we go through here, this is the fireplace I was telling you about.
Look at that.
Isn't that fantastic?
How wide's that? 12 feet? 10 feet?
It's got to be, it's got to be. And it's so big, isn't it? I mean, it's twice the size of that other little fireplace. And what you see is a status symbol.
So the equivalent of a Rolls Royce for impressing your friends.
Exactly, exactly. When you walked into that room, you were confronted with this huge fireplace, and it's saying, I've got loads of money. Look how important I am. So when the house was converted, for one reason or another, the big fireplace was put in this room, which originally wasn't heated, and the small fireplace was put into what's now the coffee house.
So they did a swap?
They did a swap. Moved the stairs around, moved the fireplaces around. But it really is, it's absolutely fantastic.
Now what about the little oven there?
The
in
little
the
oven,
corner?
of course, is much later, because by the time we get to the 1900s, this property is operating as a bakery. And of course it's a coffee shop now, and they're still selling tea cakes and cakes, so its original purpose and function has been the same for the last 100 years. We've just left the Anglebury and we're walking up Cow Lane, and we're shortly going to come out at West Walls. And of course last century it was very picturesque with thatched cottages on either side of the lane.
And it's one of the quietest parts of the town.
Often.
So why is Cow Lane called Cow Lane?
Well, I guess the name goes back centuries. It must have been the way that the townspeople got their cattle out onto the common, and the name stuck over hundreds of years.
So this lane could go back how far in history?
I guess it goes back an awful long way, because the wall builders in the 9th century respected openings in Cow Lane and on the other side of the town in the east. So there must have been a trackway, certainly in the 800s. Perhaps there was even a Roman trackway which went through the town on this particular line.
So Lilian, Wareham walls helped to defend Wareham for 300 crucial years.
More or less. They were constructed at the behest of King Alfred the Great as a defence against the marauding Vikings. Alfred's policy was to fortify places which were vulnerable by constructing earthen banks such as this, or utilising Roman defences, and he did this by placing them approximately 30 miles apart, and there were 33 such defences. Wareham was the 4th largest, which gives you an idea of the importance of Wareham at that particular time.
So when was the crunch point when they really came into their own?
The crunch point was 876, and the Anglo Saxon Chronicle records the Vikings actually getting into Wareham. So we can imagine the Viking forces probably between 1,000 and 2,000 men in the town, and Alfred's army perhaps the same number surrounding the town.
So what happened next in the walls development?
Well, 100 years later there was another Viking incursion, and the king, Ethelred the Unready, re-defended the town by constructing a stone wall on top of the earthen ramparts.
How high was that?
It was substantially enough to have a walkway on the top, but of course nothing remains today. In fact, the people who lived in the town utilised the stonework to build their cottages, so there's very little left.
So Wareham's walls were as important a defence to Wareham as Corfe Castle was to Corfe Castle.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think if I tell you that when the walls were built, the circuit of the walls was 2,200 yards in extent, and 1,600 men were needed to construct and to maintain these defences.
Are they now roughly the height they were then? In terms of earthworks?
Perhaps they've eroded a little, but they're still a very impressive monument. And in the country of Alfred's 33 fortified burhs, only 2 remain, and one is Wareham and the other one is Wallingford in Oxfordshire.
Now there's a particularly undulating part of West Walls known as the Bloody Banks. How did it get that rather lurid name?
Well, from 2 hangings which took place there. The first one was in the early Middle Ages, but the second one was in 1685, when the notorious Judge Jeffreys sentenced 5 Dorset rebels to death. They were hung, and then they were drawn, and then they were divided into 4 parts, and the parts were boiled in oil to preserve them, and then they were dispatched to various parts of Purbeck to be put on stakes, just to sort of show the general population that it didn't pay to be on the wrong side.
And if we can now go down to West Street, where the road actually cuts the walls in half, just tell me about the historical relevance of West Street and Pound Lane, because these 2 roads follow something rather important, don't they?
They do. Well, we've looked at the Saxon defences, and what we have here are the Norman defences. West Street is following the outer bailey of the Norman castle, and Pound Lane is following the inner bailey of the Norman castle.
Right, now here we've got the Pound in Pound Lane. Just explain a bit about this.
Well, it's a medieval relic, and in the Middle Ages, when people had stock, cows, sheep, and they went out on the common through the day, if they roamed or strayed, they were put into the pound, they were impounded, and their owners had to pay a fine to retrieve them.
And it was last used?
In the medieval period.
So that's just a nice curio.
So it's a curio,
Right.
medieval relic.
Now the castle's this way?
The castle's
Pound
just
Lane?
on down the lane.
Shall we?
We'll go and have a look.
I know it's hard to believe it now, but isn't this where Wareham's castle was for many years?
It is indeed, and the name Castle Close reminds us of that fact. In 1066, when William the Conqueror took over England, like Alfred, who had a policy of fortifying with earthworks, William fortified by building castles, and a Norman castle was built on the site here. But to do that, he destroyed about half of the houses in the town.
How long was the castle here and what did it look like?
It was here for about 150 years, and it looked very similar to Corfe Castle. But Corfe Castle was in a very strong defensive position, and Wareham really wasn't, and that's probably one of the reasons why it declined and decayed.
So when was the castle demolished and replaced with this house?
I don't think it was demolished, I think it decayed, and like we had on the walls where the stonework was taken away, if we look further down the lane we'll see remnants of the castle in a boundary wall. So the townspeople were actually using the stone to build their houses and to build their walls.
Now these gates to Castle Close look fascinating.
They are. They've got lovely depictions of fish, and that reminds us of the town's name and its early origins. They're supposed to be salmon, and the town's name, Wareham, is Saxon for Wareham, the settlement by the Ware. And the Ware was a fish trap, and the fish they were trapping were fish like that, they were salmon.
And of course the weather vane on top of Lady St Mary's Church.
Well, that's a Christian symbol, and the fish is a Christian symbol. So we have two types of fish indicating the various aspects of the development of the town. Shall we look at some of that Norman masonry in the rectory
some
wall?
of the nicked stone.
Now look at this wall, Andrew. Can you see these lovely blocks of stone?
Yeah.
The white ones and the red ones. Now they came from the castle site as the castle was falling down. But here we've got this rather spectacular archway.
Beautiful.
It's fantastic, isn't it? It's the only piece of masonry which survives from the castle, but we don't know whether it's in its original setting or whether it was brought here and incorporated into the wall.
And now it's in the rectory wall in a back street in Wareham.
It certainly is, and most people pass down the lane and never notice it. I think it would be quite nice now to go around the corner and to have a look at the rectory itself.
Yeah. Isn't that beautiful?
It's a superb building, but of course it was burnt down in the fire of Wareham. The Reverend John Hutchins was the incumbent here for the best part of 40 years, and while he was serving the parish of Wareham, he wrote his monumental history of the county of Dorset. At the time of the fire, John Hutchins was away from the town. His wife, it's reputed, had the foresight to save his manuscripts, because had she not, of course, we would have lost all the work that he'd been doing. So really, we owe her an enormous debt of gratitude.
Thank goodness for Mrs Hutchins.
Indeed.
That's great. Well, thank you, Lilian. It's been fascinating.
It's been all my pleasure.
And it's goodbye from us and happy exploring.